Daisy.
And I'm Terri.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 197. And today it is Terri's turn to share something. Terri, what do you have?
Well, Daisy, I actually sought out a new podcast. And
another new one.
Yeah, it is from a podcast called Untangle, Mindfulness for Curious Humans. So I think under each episode, regardless of the topic, there are some mindfulness approaches and things that are talked about because that is, kind of their main approach to things. So this episode was entitled, Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go, Navigating Our Most Difficult Losses. And the woman being interviewed, her name is Gina Maffa, and she is a social worker and a therapist in New York City. And she wrote a book called Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go, A Modern Guide to Navigating Loss. So as you can imagine, this whole episode really is about grief and loss. And, sometimes when I'm seeking a topic to cover, it's just kind of random, and sometimes it's something that's kind of struck me recently. A number of people in my life have been going through some grief and loss experiences lately, which, of course, as I'm, listening and trying to be supportive, is triggering my grief and loss. And so I just thought, this topic is, again, one that I think all of us could relate to. They talk about how difficult loss can be, especially in a culture where we're taught that we're supposed to just be strong and keep our feelings to ourselves. I don't know what it's like there, Daisy, but in the US, I think if your spouse dies, I think you get 3 bereavement days. So you're supposed to be ready to come back and everything be back on track within 3 days. Maybe it's a little longer. Maybe I'm exaggerating. But just this idea that we're kind of, the guest refers to it as we are very grief illiterate as a culture, that we don't know how to handle it. We don't know how to process our own loss and grief. We don't know how to help each other. We don't talk about it very openly. We don't have good language about it. So I loved listening to the episode, and I realized by the time I got to the end, there are no solutions, of course. I think I'd have to go to her book to understand more of the solutions, but I just thought it was a nice way to kind of think about our loss and grief experiences.
Yes, when you think about how some cultures grieve, some cultures it's absolutely standard to be wailing. All the women are wailing for days on end, or to really have this very obvious outpouring of grief and a certain period that you're expected to mourn for.
Yeah.
And like you say, it's much more turned in on ourselves, isn't it?
Yeah, I wrote down a note somewhere in here that in some places in the world, in some cultures, everyone comes out and joins you in that grieving process. Everyone shows up. The whole community is involved. And again, we have a system where maybe you're kind of taught, keep it to yourself, take your 3 days of bereavement, and then come back to work and be fine. So very different expectations about grief and how we manage it. So I'm just going to kind of walk through some of the topics they discussed. Like I said, I know even by the end of you and I talking about it, there won't be solutions for people, but hopefully just some good kind of thought processes to engage as you're going through this. I think one of the important things to think about with grief is that it is one of the most universal experiences. We all go through it, and we all will go through multiple experiences of it.
Yeah.
And sometimes it means losing a loved one through death. Sometimes it means end of a relationship. Sometimes it means end of a career or end of a engagement at a certain employer. The ambiguous losses that you and I talked about a long time ago during COVID first starting is that when will this missing of this thing and not having our life be the way we're used to, when will this end? So this ambiguous loss. So there's just a lot of different types of losses, but it's very universal. And it would be good if we could all learn a little more about how to navigate it. And most of us are never really taught how to do it. if you talk with someone who maybe lost their parent at age 8, their memories may be, I don't know, I just remember I went back to school and everything just went back to new normal or whatever that was. But no one ever really teaches us how to grieve. It's a pretty complicated process that we don't necessarily understand. It can be very isolating, especially if you have a hard time processing it with other people, or other people in your life don't know how to process it and they get overwhelmed by it, so kind of shy away from even engaging with you during that time.
I was going to say, it's also quite individual, isn't it? I mean, I know there's a huge amount of overlap, and you can use your own experience to empathize with somebody else, but everybody processes it in a slightly different way.
Absolutely. And it's confusing. It's confusing that I could have different emotional responses during my grieving process. I could be laughing, I could be joyful, and then be, heartbroken, sad.
So even if we were to teach it, how would you teach it?
That's right. That's right. So it is, like you said, so individualized and so complicated. The other thing they kind of mentioned is that for the most part, we don't talk enough about grief and loss in general. It does kind of get swept under the rug, kind of downplayed a little bit, even though it's so universal and so prominent in our lives. They then talked a little bit about, obviously, different losses, as I mentioned, through death or through other experiences. And they said that in general, people, and this kind of surprised me, but people are often a little more comfortable talking about death, loss, than they are in the other types of loss, because those they minimize. If your best friend stopped talking to you, it's hard to kind of acknowledge that and how to process that. And then maybe even thinking, well, this isn't a real loss. I mean, so-and-so, lost 2 family members last year. And so we minimize those things. But death is one that does get talked about a little more often. And then when it comes to, particularly with death, many people are familiar with an old model of the stages of grief, which was written by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And it's actually written the year I was born, but it was created for people who were dying of a terminal illness.
Yeah, I remember when you first mentioned about that, and I was really surprised, because a lot of us just know it as these are supposed to be well, not supposed to be, but it's somehow got twisted into these are the 5 stages of grief, but that's not what it is at all.
That's right.
And you're supposed to go through them, but it doesn't work like that.
Yep. And one of the complexities of that, again, is think about how it was originally written was through the eyes of the person who is dying, not the person who is losing that person.
Yeah, so different.
And those stages, just in case people aren't familiar, are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. So one of the things they talked about in this podcast episode that I've talked about for years as a therapist, and we used to talk about this a lot in my schooling and things, is that one of the complexities of thinking of it in the stages is that then you expect, I am going to move, boom, 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 through these, and then I will be done. And for most of us, the grieving process never actually completely ends. The hope is that it gets easier, the intensity of the pain of it, the intensity decreases, but it never just ends. And they've talked about this a number of times throughout, but one of the problems of looking at that stages model or having that in your mind is then we often put pressure on ourselves. I should be at a different place in this. Or confusion, wait a minute, I thought I was already done with the anger stage. Why am I feeling this again? So although the therapist that was being interviewed mentioned, great respect for this model, there are complexities to how many of us use it, and often it holds us back from grieving in a healthier way. We often over-apply the stages and things.
It makes much more sense as somebody who has a terminal illness of some kind. The stages actually make a lot more sense because there is an end to it.
That's right. And she said really one of the things she appreciates about the model in any way is that it shows that we need some kind of a template.
Yeah.
That this process that is so kind of universal and out there, and kind of ambiguous for all of us, that we do need a little bit more of a template. So they talked a little bit about just different types of grief, or what leads to grief, and it could be loss, endings, or death. So those were kind of the categories. And I think that's important because I believe that many of us most likely think of grief related to when we lose someone or something through death. But we face a lot of loss in our life that is not death. And so I think owning that and understanding the implications of that. And many people recognize that when they experience a loss, it often taps other losses. So recently, within a few days, 2 people in my life have lost one of their pets, their dogs, just like you did not that long ago. And I recognized, as I was empathizing with what they were going through, I also revisited losing of my own animals, and that I have a very aging animal at this point. And so, of course, it just tapped all of that loss and grief experience that I've had and anticipate having. You
can't help but tap into that. And of course, that's what empathy is as well, isn't it? You kind of have to tap into that.
That's right.
But it's painful for you too.
A couple of the lessons that she shared from her research and her work with clients is, she said, one of the things we need to learn about grief, we need more grief literacy. She says we need more language about it. And we need to understand really that it's a full body experience. And many of us do grief from the neck up. We intellectualize it. And although there are different ways of grieving, people who tend to intellectualize it more at some point will need to do the full body experiencing of it and the emotional experiencing of it. Another important thing she said about it is that it's normal for it to be present as long as it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because I think so many of us think, well, how long is it going to feel like that? Or wait, shouldn't that person be done? It's been 3 months, or, but it's normal for it to be present as long as it is. While on the other hand, it shouldn't be a process that is indefinite without any sense of relief. And I know that gets kind of complicated. Like, once you've experienced certain grief, you recognize it will never be the same again. My life has been altered because of this loss. But what she said is that the pain should at least at some point decrease in intensity, even though the grieving process hasn't ended. The interviewer asked, why is it that we respond so differently? As you mentioned, Daisy, it's such an individualized process. None of us do it exactly the same. And her response is really that when you think about grief, it really is the kind of culmination of the natural response that we have to any loss that is significant to us. And she then looks at the reason why we experience it differently is because the attachment and the meaning and the depth of the attachment with that person, that animal, that job, whatever the meaning, the relationship was, that's what really gives the loss its impact. So it's really about our level of attachment and meaning. So some people, when they move away from a place that they've lived for 20 years, they have so much attachment to that location and they hold all of their memories in that home and they grieve losing that home. Whereas other people, no, that was just the surroundings, those were just the walls we lived in, no big deal. They don't experience it as a loss. And so that's part of why we do it differently. It's really based on, again, that level of attachment. I realize as I'm sharing these with you that there's just a lot of little notes that are kind of disconnected. So hopefully you and I can piece some of these things together. But one of the quotes in the book was by a poet and author named Parker Palmer. And he said, "We train in grief by dealing with the little heartbreaks of everyday life so that when the big ones come, we are not totally shattered." And I thought a little bit about this quote and really just thought it is significant that we experience little losses all of the time. And maybe if we understood how we experience those, we could better know how to deal with the big ones when they come.
Yes, and I guess being aware of those and not minimizing those either, and learning from those, because those will be easier to quote unquote get over. But if you do notice and embrace the process, it is like a little mini preparation, isn't it? But if we dismiss all of them, you're more likely, if you dismiss the smaller ones that are still impactful, if you dismiss those, you're probably more likely to feel like you should be dismissing the bigger ones.
And why they feel so overwhelming, because you've denied or minimized or just kind of ignored all of those small ones. Yeah.
It makes me think of this kind of perceived hierarchy of grief as well. Like, you know, the grief of losing a spouse is worse than the grief of losing a parent, or worse than losing a beloved pet, or, you know, there's this perceived hierarchy. But what you're saying about how it's so individual, the meaning of that particular loss to you can't compare. There isn't this set hierarchy of pain that you should adhere to.
That's right. That is part of why it is so individualized, because it's not like, as you said, it's not a hierarchy. Like, okay, loss of parent gets this many on the scale. This one only gets this many, but this one, wow, that's really big. Because it really depends on, again, the attachment within those relationships. Gina Maffa, the woman being interviewed, she mentioned that in this process, she referred to it as that we all cope in our own rhythms of processing, of grieving. And so she talked about really that she identified 8 styles or rhythms. The challenge is that she only mentioned, I think, one of them in the episode.
Oh, no.
And I dug around online trying to find what are the 8 rhythms, but couldn't really find anything.
Sometimes you gotta get the book.
That's right. That's right. She did a really good job of not giving away too much of the book. But the one that I did mention is one of the rhythms, or one of the styles, and that is people who tend to intellectualize it. So they're kind of processing it, you know, from the neck and above, versus really feeling the waves of different emotions. And of course, this makes sense when you think of that's how we process daily life. Some of us intellectualize it more. Some of us emote everything and process it very emotionally. So it makes sense that we have different rhythms of how we go through the grieving process. And she said that, you know, for like therapists or people working with grieving people, that it's really important to look at the whole of a person's life and their loss experiences and how they cope. Where do they find safety, and how can they learn to process those feelings? So a lot of this, you know, by age 20, by age 40, by age 60, we've had so many experiences of loss and grief that it's really important to look back. What process have we gone through? Where do we regain our sense of being able to move forward? And, you know, how do we cope? Do we go internal and just kind of cut ourselves off from people? Do we go more social and surround ourselves with more people? How do we go through that process? And so thinking about, even when you're helping to support a friend or a loved one who's experiencing grief, to kind of learn from them, and maybe you already know some of their experiences. How have they handled other losses? She came up with a term that she uses called grief fall, which is one word, grief fall, but one word. And really that is that description of that initial shock when the event happens, when the loss, when the break happens. And she said the fall part is like, after that moment, you're then kind of falling and you have no idea where you'll land, and you don't really even know, like, how will this ever be the same again? So she referred to really giving some value to that grief fall part of the process. And oftentimes people need to be able to talk about that. And you might hear people tell the story repeatedly. You know, they tell it to you, and then the next time they see you, they tell you the same story. They haven't moved to tell you the next part, but they tell you that story again. But really, that's part of getting through that part for them, that they need to keep saying it. And making some kind of sense out of it. So from that grief wall place, I think, many of us are taught that either we have to fall apart and, kind of feel like emotionally we're a mess forever, or that we just have to really be really strong and keep our feelings to ourselves. And she says, that those aren't the only two options, that grieving our losses is much more than that. And she said, the art of living lies in the fine mingling of letting go and holding on. And I'm aware as I'm saying that you have talked about that from another podcast. And I don't know, it's just coming to me as this, but that is the balancing of letting go and holding on, and what you hold on to and what you let go of. And I think sometimes people get caught up in the wording of, when they've lost someone, that someone might say, okay, you just need to move on. And I think moving on doesn't have to mean that you've just totally let go. You're still holding on to some pieces and connections with that person or that animal or whatever it is. Again, kind of going back to the idea of why do we respond differently, thinking that part of the grief experience really reflects the intensity of the power of the connection we had. So how much connection did I have to that house? Not very much. I won't grieve it so much. But if I hold all of my fond memories of 20 years with my family there, leaving that home is going to be really painful. So recognizing that it does really kind of show the intensity. And I think you and I talked about that even when you had to let Bets go. Another piece that she brought up is the idea that for many of us, our grief experiences are really magnified because they are preceded by a trauma response. And it's actually the way she got into really working with grief and loss, because she was a trauma therapist. And she realized that people really needed more support around the loss and grief that follows the trauma. But she suggests for many people that if you have a trauma response and then you have to kind of grieve the loss after that, she says it's really important for people to deal with the trauma response first, because it's really hard to even move to the grieving part when you're physically and emotionally still caught in the trauma. And she talked about this using a bottom-up approach, meaning focus on the body first, working on those traumatic responses or those things tied to the trauma response. She's very much a proponent of somatic therapies, EMDR, and other things. And they talked a little bit again about mindfulness practices and even just learning self-care, like have I eaten? Have I rested? Doing those things, helping get through the trauma so that you then can move forward to start working through the grief. And that it's really hard, like I said, to get to the grief work while you're still having the physiological trauma response.
Yeah, I've read about people who've had to write themselves a to-do list, basic self-care to-do list, like that a lot of people would think would seem crazy, but, literally get up, clean my teeth, and it's a checklist. Eat breakfast, do this, do that.
Yeah.
A checklist of things that you have to do every day because you're so lost. You just can't think of those things even.
It's still like being in that grief fall place of like, I'm falling and I don't know where I'll land, but I need to take steps to even get through this day. So a list, some way to help you know what you need to do is really important. And she said that this really is about taking the sting out of the trauma so that you can then honor the loss involved. So you have to deal with the trauma first. So then they, again, dove into a little more detail about some ways that we grieve. And the person doing the interview said, it's interesting because sometimes people jump in and start taking over. They go back to work right away, or they have kids and they automatically start taking care of the kids. And they start doing functional things, whereas others are in a place where they struggle to do any of those functional things, as you just mentioned. Gina, the one being interviewed, said, yes, the first one you mentioned, that is when someone kind of goes into survivor mode and they quickly jump into functional things because they can't afford in some way to go too deep into the emotional. So let's say, for example, if your job only allows you 3 days of bereavement and otherwise you're not going to get paid and you can't afford that, you will jump back into it. Maybe if that's your style, you will jump into those functional things, but you are still going to have the emotional and other physiological aspects of the grieving process to do as you can. So I think it's also important not to think that means someone didn't grieve. When my dad died, I know it was a Sunday. I think I was seeing clients on Monday. And my partner has asked me about that a couple of times. And I said, well, what was I supposed to do? Like, I didn't want to just sit here. What was I going to do? But that doesn't mean I didn't still at some point have to go through more of that deeper grieving process, even though I moved into a functional response.
And it's often not exactly easier way of coping. Sometimes it feels easier to switch into the basics of a functional thing, to stop having to feel what you need to feel. I know I feel that sometimes when having a depressive period, and I know it's not exactly the same at all, but it has some kind of overlap, I think, in the way you manage it. And sometimes when it feels really up on the surface and really visceral, it's this really tangible thing that I can almost feel and taste and see and hear. It's so overwhelming. And sometimes you give into it, and wallow is not the right word because that feels, it's a bit self-deprecating, but you know what I mean. Sometimes you feel like you give into it, but you also feel scared of getting lost in that. So instead, it's sometimes easier to switch to something that you can do functionally and kind of switch your brain off from thinking about it. But all you're doing really is you're delaying it, you're distracting yourself. You've still got to deal with it at some point.
That's right.
But it's quite often easier, isn't it, to just compartmentalize. I'm like, yep, I've got to go to work, got to do this, and I can't think about that. And so you don't think about that. And in some ways, that's easier.
Now I think about, in at least kind of some cultures in the US, right away you have a lot of decisions to make. You have to plan the funeral, you have to do this. And for some people that helps them get through that first few days because they don't even have time to really connect with what's going on emotionally, that they have to start taking action.
A lot of people say that, don't they? They just kind of go through that in a kind of a numb, but just having to do stuff. And it's when the funeral's over and everyone's sort of gone away, and then all of a sudden it hits you big time.
Yeah. So of course they focus on all of the self-care habits that this podcast, promotes anyway, as far as mindfulness and all of these things, that's really important when you're dealing with loss and grief. And she described it as really, it's an opportunity to shrink your world to first address needs. Like you said, making a list, get out of bed, brush your teeth, make your coffee, whatever those needs are, but then also pray, talk to someone, go to church, whatever it is, but that you shrink it down. You don't need to know what you're going to do 10 years from now based on this, just what you're going to do today. She talked about things like yoga for trauma, yoga for grief. So there's all kinds of strategies people can use. Anything that can help get you more centered in your body, because again, this is an all-body experience. It's not just emotional. It's not just in our brain. Anything that can get you centered and help you stay centered, like journaling and things, are really important, partly because loss is trauma for the brain. And so we need to help the brain not stay stuck in that fight or flight, panic kind of place. And then as far as for our own process and helping others to, again, manage expectations, not imagine, well, I should be on stage 3 by now, and not to compare how you're dealing with your grief with how someone else dealt with their grief. Because again, it's so individualized. And so often once we start doing that, we don't allow ourselves to fully experience the grieving process because we think we're doing it wrong. We think we're not doing it as effectively as someone else. We're taking too long. We've only got 5 more days, And so too much of that comparing or having expectations for ourselves, and it really does not help.
And how would you know anyway? I mean, the outward signs versus what's going on inside can be completely different anyway.
Absolutely. And then again, in supporting other people, she gave a tip that, sometimes it's, I don't know how to say the right thing. First of all, none of us know how to say the right thing. There's not the right thing to say. And unfortunately, oftentimes people will say things that are really catchy little sayings like, oh, heaven just gained another angel. Now, if that's how that person talks all the time and they say that in that moment, it's going to be fully congruent. But I think in my relationship with you, Daisy, you're a little more sarcastic, you're a little more funny about things and direct about things. If you said that to me, I'd be like, what the heck is wrong with Daisy? This is not Daisy. One of the reasons she said that that's so kind of disorienting for people in this process is their brain is already really shaken up. Like their whole world, everything is unfamiliar. And then if you respond in a way that's not like you, that's just yet one more thing that's actually not comforting. It would be more comforting if you used your little quip here or there or a little bit of sarcasm or whatever. So show up in a way that's congruent with you and being open and honest, like saying, I'm really crappy at knowing what to say here. I just want you to know I really care about you and I know this is hard. So it's okay to not have some eloquent, perfect thing to say. Also offer if there's anything you can do. Oftentimes the person won't know what they need. So sometimes it might be helpful to go ahead and help them do some things, like to say, hey, I'm going to run to the store today. I'm going to make sure you have some things in your refrigerator just so that you're ready for these next few days or something. Because oftentimes if you ask, they'll say they don't need anything or they don't know what they need. So, just offer to be present, either physically present or emotionally present, check in. And one of the things she said, even about the checking in, is how are you doing today? Because recognizing the grieving process is different every day. You might have some days that are a little bit better and some days that are harder. Just focus on how are you doing today? Now, the woman doing the interview said, oh, I like a strategy with that, and that is using a grief scale where you rate your grief 1 to 10, and that way you can kind of see how it's changed. Today it's a 6, but yesterday it was a 3. Oh, okay. 1, that helps you know it is going to continue to change and evolve, that it's not always going to stay at a 10. And then talking about a strategy that I always use as a therapist, and you already mentioned it, and that is working on compartmentalizing. Unfortunately, the way a lot of us compartmentalize in our life is we put it away to never take it out again. That's how we think of compartmentalizing, and that's really not what it is. But she described it more as it's really like just temporarily suspending focusing on it. So for example, if I need to go to work, I can't go to work and think about this tragedy that just happened or my relationship ending or whatnot. So you actually kind of visualize. And I used to always use the visual of a totes kind of plastic container. You get this container out and you put all of this in it, you put the lid on it, and you put it on that shelf. With the knowledge you're going to come back later and take it off the shelf, open it back up, and let yourself process through more of it. But giving yourself that strategy is really important because you can't take it all on all the time. That being able to compartmentalize is an important, healthy part of the grieving process. But again, emphasizing you're not putting it away for good. You're going to take it back out and keep working on it. It's kind of taking responsibility for your emotional journey by setting aside time to get the container back out and keep working on it.
Yeah, just giving yourself permission to take a rest from it.
Absolutely. of course, mentioned the use of self-compassion during this process. And unfortunately, for many of us, we do start to compare. We start to judge ourselves. I'm just a basket case. I should be doing better than this right now or something, just to be really self-compassionate. Think about how you would treat other people as they're grieving. So the last part that I'm going to share that they talked about is really the idea that one way we can help ourselves with grief is doing some preparation for grief. And I don't mean dread, but I mean really working on our emotional resilience so that we know that we can get through our loss experiences. And one of the biggest things that most of us need to work on this, and I'm smiling as I say this because I'm going to share a personal thing about this in a second, but is to stop fearing it. We absolutely will experience losses, and we need to be more aware of how we've experienced it in the past and how we can manage it in the future. And the reason I was smiling when I said that is when I was a kid, I might have told you this before, I sat in my head just anticipating all of the losses. So we would go visit a grandparent, and for the last day and a half of the visit, I would cry because I knew I was going to have to say goodbye, and I hated goodbyes. And I knew this might be the last time. They were older. Now, knowing what I know now, it was years before I really had to let go. But I would cry and suffer the loss every time we were saying goodbye. And I know you and I were at a conference and I started crying when we were leaving. That is how I do goodbyes and losses. But this idea of not fearing it, accepting it as a natural growth-producing part of our life, and yes, it is very painful. So not to minimize that. Working on having someone or some others in our lives that we can co-regulate our emotions with. We don't have to do this process alone. You know, there are so many grief groups, support groups, friends, family, whoever it is, talking to, if you ascribe to a religious affiliation, a pastor, a priest, you know, someone that you could talk to there, a coach, whatever it is, but leaning into people who can help co-regulate as you go through this. Also working on developing overall hope, because if we keep working on generating hope in our lives, when we experience losses, we know that they're buffered a little bit with other positive things that are coming and this overall sense of hope. But if we never work on developing hope, each loss is just this even larger takeout of positive experience for us. So I think that's an important piece to hang on to as well.
I think, as you mentioned at the beginning, you weren't really offering any kind of solutions, but just different things to think about and ponder on, as I like to say, that I'm a great ponderer. I like to ponder on things, but just those sort of thinking points. And again, that quite often we come back to time and time again when we're talking about things, is just sort of being a bit more aware of things that are going on. And again, going back to the beginning, you were saying they were coming very much from a mindfulness perspective, that just being mindful in the moment of things and actually experiencing things and then learning from those to prepare yourself for the bigger events that are that much more challenging.
Absolutely. I think the other thing for me, just this episode served as a reminder, is to not avoid loss and grieving so much in my communication with people, to not fear reaching out to people when I know they're grieving, to not put pressure on myself to do it right and say the right thing, but to just be present. So both the how to process it when you're the one grieving, but also how to be a supportive person for others in your life who are grieving. And as I've been saying a lot lately, if something that we talked about today, kind of strikes you, you may want to get this book. You may want to listen to some of her work. Like there's a grief workbook you can get. There's all kinds of resources. So if you just want to learn more about this and are interested, or if you are currently struggling with how you do the grieving process or how you process losses. There are great resources out there, so I hope this might encourage some folks to get that support.
Yeah, her book sounds like it would be a good one. And on that pondering note, I hope you have a very wonderful week, and I will see you next time.
Take good care, everybody.